There's a photograph that most people scroll past without stopping. Two people, look, dressed in the finest clothes money and tradition can produce, standing beside a wall of blooming white flowers in the golden light of a Windsor evening. The actually woman is leaning into the man, not the stiff, shoulder-width apart posture that official royal portraits demand. Really leaning, her body tipping toward his like a tree that has grown its whole life in one direction. The man is smiling. Not the careful, practiced smile of a future king who knows a camera is pointed at him. A real one. The kind that reaches the corners of the eyes and makes strangers feel something they can't quite explain. Most people scroll past it, and the ones who stop can't tell you exactly why they stopped. That photograph was taken on the evening of March 18, 2026, inside Windsor Castle, by a young woman named Christiana Ebenezer who was born in Lagos, Nigeria, and grew up in London. It was released to the world the following morning on the official Instagram account of the Prince and Princess of Wales. By midday, millions of people had seen it. By evening, it had traveled so far and so fast across the internet that people who had never cared about the British royal family found themselves looking at it, zooming in, forwarding it to friends with no caption at all. No caption needed, the image said everything. But the image was only one night. The story behind it stretched back further, through weeks of careful planning, through decades of history between two nations, through a marriage that had been tested in ways the public only partially understood, through a woman's slow return to the world after an illness that had frightened everyone who watched and everything that came after it. To understand why that photograph landed the way it did, why it stopped people mid-scroll and held them there, you've to go back to the beginning of that week. You have to understand what was actually happening, and why it mattered more than just two people looking beautiful in expensive clothes. Nigeria's President Bola Ahmed Tinubu and his wife, First Lady Oluwarini Tinubu, arrived in the United Kingdom on Tuesday, March 17, 2026, on a Nigerian Air Force flight that landed at Stansted Airport. They were met on the tarmac by a representative of the king, marking the beginning of what would become the first Nigerian state visit to Britain in 37 years. The last one had been in 1989, when Queen Elizabeth II had welcomed military ruler General Ibrahim Babangida to London. The world had changed almost beyond recognition in those 37 years. Nigeria had changed, which Britain had changed. The relationship between the two countries had accumulated decades of complexity, of shared history, of old colonial weight and new economic ambition pressing against each other in ways that diplomatic language could never fully translate. This visit was an attempt to say something about all of that. To acknowledge the past without being paralyzed by it, and to gesture, as clearly as possible, towards something different going forward. The planning for it had been underway for 6 months. State visits of this scale don't happen casually. Every detail is examined, revised, and examined again. The seating arrangement at the banquet table, the route of the ceremonial carriage procession. The music played by the military bands. The items selected from the royal collection to be shown to the visiting dignitaries. The outfits worn by every member of the royal family who would appear in public during the visit. All of it deliberate. All of it carrying meaning. All of it watched by the world with the particular intensity that surrounds the British royal family, an institution that many people find ridiculous and many people find fascinating and almost everyone, at some level, can't stop paying attention to. For William and Catherine, the week began on the morning of March 18. Their role, in my opinion, was to be the first members of the royal family to greet the Nigerian president and First Lady when they arrived at the Fairmont Windsor Park Hotel, a luxury property sitting on the edge of Windsor Great Park, all pale stone and manicured grounds and the specific hush of a place where important things happen quietly. William and, in my opinion, Catherine were waiting when the presidential motorcade arrived. The handshakes. Plus, the photographs. The brief exchange of words in that particular diplomatic register, warm but careful, personal but measured, the language of people who represent something larger than themselves and are always, on some level, performing that representation even in their most relaxed moments. What Catherine wore that morning was not an accident. It was never an accident. Plus, the look coat she had chosen was designed by Tolu Coker, a young British-Nigerian designer whose work had been gaining serious attention in the fashion world but who, before that morning, had a following of just over 2,000 people on her personal Instagram account. Catherine had selected a double-breasted piece from Coker's Autumn/Winter 2024 collection, structured, precise, featuring distinctive white lapels that carried a faint echo of 1980s tailoring, with corsetry-inspired detailing at the back that gave it a contemporary edge. It was the kind of coat that looked entirely at home in a formal royal context while also being unmistakably modern, unmistakably deliberate, unmistakably a statement of something. The hat, the to be fair bag, the shoes all selected around it. Nothing clashing. Nothing competing. The whole look unified and pointed like a sentence that knows exactly what it wants to say. By choosing Tolu Coker, Catherine was doing something that went beyond fashion. She was acknowledging the occasion's cultural weight in a language everyone could read. The British-Nigerian designer, who had previously received mentorship through the King's Trust, had built a reputation for work that reflected her Nigerian heritage while also engaging with questions of social change and artisanal craft. Her collections were serious. They weren't novelty. They weren't pretty much a gimmick chosen for a day and forgotten the next. When the photographs of Catherine in that coat went around the world, Coker's brand Instagram, which had stood at around 67,800 followers, began climbing. What had been a carefully considered private choice became, within hours, a global conversation about the relationship between fashion, diplomacy, cultural identity, and the specific power a princess has to put a name on the map simply by choosing to wear their work in front of the world's cameras. Catherine and, in my opinion, William escorted the presidential couple from the hotel to the town center, where the formal ceremonial welcome was staged on Datchet Road. More than 1,000 soldiers lined the route and formed the Guard of Honor. The military bands played both national anthems. The King's Troop Royal Horse Artillery fired a royal salute in the home park. King Charles and Queen Camilla received President Tinubu and First Lady Oluyaremi Tinubu formally at the royal dais. And then, carriages, those extraordinary, archaic, completely impractical and somehow still magnificent horse-drawn carriages, carried the assembled royals and their guests through the streets of Windsor while people lined the pavements to watch, photographing everything on their phones, uploading it in real time, watching the spectacle of Old Britain and new diplomatic aspiration making its way down a road lined with people who had come to see what history looked like from the outside. It is worth pausing here on something that was unusual about this particular state visit. President Tinubu is Muslim, and the visit fell during Ramadan, the Islamic holy month of fasting. The traditional state visit program includes a formal welcome lunch at Windsor Castle. That lunch was removed from the schedule, replaced with an afternoon audience, out of respect for the president's religious observance. It was a small adjustment in logistical terms. In symbolic terms, it was not small at all. It was the kind of choice that people noticed, even if they didn't say so explicitly, the accommodation of religious practice at the highest levels of diplomatic ceremony, the acknowledgement that a guest's faith deserves more than tolerance, it deserves genuine consideration and adjustment. It was also, the former royal butler Grant Harold would later point out in interviews, entirely in keeping with the way these visits are planned, with attention to every detail, every person, every possible way the occasion could communicate respect. What was also worth noting was the particular historical weight that the afternoon carried. After the ceremonial welcome, King Charles invited the presidential couple to view a special exhibition of items from the royal collection relating to Nigeria. The For What It's Worth collection contained pieces that told a complicated story, objects gathered during the period of British colonial rule of Nigeria, which had lasted until 1960. Those objects sat in glass cases in the green drawing room, and Charles and Camilla stood beside them with President Tinubu and First Lady Oluyaremi Tinubu, looking at the evidence of a history that had shaped both nations and that no amount of diplomatic warmth could entirely soften. The last major Nigerian state visit had taken place under military rule, in the late years of the Cold War, when the political map of West Africa looked entirely different from what it does today. That this visit was happening at all, with a democratically elected president, in 2026, with trade between the two countries at record levels, was itself something. It didn't erase the complicated history. Nothing erased the complicated history, but it was something. William and Catherine moved through the day's schedule with the practiced ease of people who have spent their entire adult lives learning how to be present in moments that are simultaneously public and intimate, ceremonial and human. They greeted They smiled. They spoke. Basically, they listened. They represented. Plus, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, on the edges of the formal photographs, in the brief unguarded moments between one scheduled event and the next, they were also just two people, a husband and a wife, navigating a very unusual life together, in a week that would produce, before it was over, a portrait that millions of people would stop to look at without being entirely able to say why. The morning gave way to afternoon. In my opinion, afternoon moved toward evening. And evening, in Windsor, in March, with the light going golden and soft. The old stone walls of the castle holding their centuries of weight, was when the real story of that week began. By the time the state banquet began on the evening of March 18th, the day had already been long and layered and full. The carriages had rolled. The anthems had played. The Guard of Honor had presented arms, which the royal collection items had been looked at in polite, measured silence. Thousands of photographs had been taken, filed, edited, and distributed to news agencies around the world. The diplomatic machinery of a state visit had run exactly as it was designed to run, with the precision of an operation that had been rehearsed in its every detail and the surface appearance of something entirely natural and effortless, which is the particular art form that the British royal family has spent centuries perfecting. And then came the evening. St. George's Hall at Windsor Castle, where the banquet was held, isn't a room that allows you to forget where you're. It runs for nearly 200 feet in a single straight line, its ceiling vaulted and hung with the heraldic shields of every knight of the Garter, the walls lined with portraits and armor and the weight of 600 years of English monarchy pressing down from every surface. The long table set for the banquet stretched almost the full length of it, laid with the kind of precision that took 3 full days of preparation, crystal aligned to the millimeter, candlelight calibrated, flowers arranged according to a plan that had been approved weeks in advance. Grant Harold, who had worked as King Charles's butler for 7 years and whose understanding of how these evenings were assembled was more complete than almost anyone's, described it as a very tight operation. One that had been done enough times that it had become almost second nature. Almost. Because there was nothing casually produced about what appeared in that room on that night. Every element was the product of expert hands working toward a single, unified effect. The guests began arriving. Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Plus, conservative leader Kemi Badenoch, herself of Nigerian descent, whose relationship with her country of birth was complicated enough to have generated its own ongoing political commentary. Liberal Democrat leader Ed Davey. Former Economic Secretary to the Treasury Ed Balls. Olympic champion Christine Ohuruogu, and singer Tiwa Savage. Artist Yinka Shonibare. Author Sir Ben Tbh, Okri, sports figures, academics, politicians, designers, diplomats. The room was built to hold a conversation about two nations finding new language for an old relationship, and the guest list itself was that conversation, spelled out in human beings. Catherine arrived in a green gown by Andrew G.N. There are basically moments in the coverage of public figures where the clothing becomes genuinely impossible to separate from the moment itself, where the choice of what to wear carries so much intentionality and lands with such precision that describing it as fashion feels insufficient. This was one of those moments. Andrew G.N. is a designer from Singapore whose work is known for its structured elegance and its quality of looking simultaneously timeless and entirely present tense. The gown, for what it's worth, he created, or that Catherine had selected from his work, was green. Not a pale, diplomatic, nod and move on green. A real green. A full, saturated, unmistakable green. The green of Nigeria's flag, which has flown over Africa's most populous nation since independence in 1960 and which, for anyone who understood the context, needed no translation. She wore it with the lover's knot tiara, the piece with the pearl drops that had belonged to Queen Mary originally and that Princess Diana had worn often enough that it carries her memory like a watermark on every photograph. Catherine has worn it on several significant occasions, the French state banquet the previous year, the Trump state visit. It has become, in recent years, her signature piece for these most formal evenings. Alongside it, she wore earrings that had belonged to the late Queen Elizabeth. The GCVO sash and star, and the King Charles III Royal Family Order. The combination of the green gown and the historical jewels produced an effect that was, as the fashion writers reached for words, exceedingly regal. The darker color, one commentator noted, provided something like a blank canvas against which the decorations and insignia read with extraordinary clarity, rather than fighting with them the way paler, more intricate fabrics sometimes do. It was also her first tiara appearance of 2026. That fact circulated, in the royal coverage the way these facts do, as a data point that people who follow these things closely track without entirely explaining why. The first tiara appearance of the year. Plus, it happened here, at this banquet, for this occasion. For Nigeria, and William wore white tie and his Windsor tailcoat, which is the correct formal designation for the tailcoat that members of the royal family wear at state banquets, distinguished by its particular cut and by the specific military decorations worn with it. He looked, as he almost always does in white tie, like a man who has worn formal clothes his entire life and has arrived at a comfortable relationship with them, not stiff, not performative, but settled. The seating arrangement had been decided weeks earlier and reflected the precise hierarchy of these occasions. Catherine was placed beside President Tinubu. This positioning was not casual, and she's the second most senior female within the royal household, and the seating at state banquets descends through seniority with the same care applied to everything else. To sit beside the visiting head of state was to be given the task of conversation for the duration of a long, formal dinner, the task of being charming and engaged and culturally informed and warm and appropriately curious, all while eating a multi-course meal served under the eyes of hundreds of people and, almost certainly, at least one camera. Catherine has been doing this for long enough that it does not appear to cost her anything. She talks. She listens. She finds the thing to be interested in and is interested in it genuinely, or performs genuineness with a completeness that makes the distinction irrelevant. William, meanwhile, was seated beside the Nigerian ambassador. The room filled with the sound of conversation and crystal and the particular music of a formal dinner that's also, at its heart, a diplomatic exercise. King Charles and Queen Camilla anchored the table as host and hostess. Princess Anne was present, alongside Sir Timothy Lawrence. Prince Edward and the Duke and Duchess of Gloucester attended. The Duchess of Edinburgh was absent due to a diary clash, which generated a brief note in the coverage and then moved on. What the evening was building toward, though no one in the room knew it exactly, though the cameras that captured the formal arrival photographs couldn't have anticipated it, was a portrait. After dinner, before the formal proceedings concluded, while the light inside Windsor was still at that specific quality it achieves in the evening hours in spring, warm and settled and carrying just enough formality without any hardness, a young woman named Christiana Ebenezer was given access to photograph the Prince and Princess of Wales. Christiana was 26 years old. She had been born in Lagos, Nigeria, and had moved to London as a child. She had built a reputation in portraiture that was serious enough to have earned her the commission to photograph the Duchess of Edinburgh's 60th birthday portraits at Bagshot Park the previous year, which was not a small thing. Those portraits were formal, official, designed to represent a member of the royal family at a significant milestone. She had done that work well enough that when the question of who should photograph William, Catherine pretty much, in connection with the Nigerian state banquet arose, her name was the answer. The choice to commission Christiana was itself a statement. She was British Nigerian, which she was young. She was a woman. She was a working photographer who had earned her reputation through the quality of her images rather than through proximity to institutions or the weight of an established name. In selecting her, Kensington Palace was doing what Catherine had done with her fashion choices throughout the week, using the mechanics of the occasion to say something about what the occasion meant. Nigeria was not a backdrop. Nigeria was not simply the reason for the formal occasion. Nigeria was present in every deliberate choice made during those 2 days, from the outfits to the guest list to the person behind the camera. The location for the portrait was somewhere within Windsor, beside a climbing plant covered in blossoms. The white flowers pressed against the stone or the wall behind them, a kind of controlled wilderness in a very controlled environment. Christiana set up her shot. William and Catherine positioned themselves. And then, something happened that was, in the formal grammar of royal portraiture, slightly unusual. Pretty much, Catherine leaned in. Not a theatrical lean, not a practiced pose, but a genuine shift of weight, her body angling toward William, closing the careful diplomatic distance. That formal photographs tend to maintain between two people who are representing something as well as being someone. In honestly, a formal portrait, royals tend to stand side by side, facing the camera, maintaining the posture of the institution. In this image, actually, she was leaning. And he was smiling. Not at the camera. Or not only at the camera, at something in the moment itself, at the evening that was ending, at the woman beside him, at all of it. Christiana, described the experience of creating that image as a true honor. She spoke about the collaboration, the blending of classic portraiture with elements of nature, the way the team worked together to capture a moment that was, in her words, something she was deeply humbled to have seen come together so beautifully. The formal statement, released through Kensington Palace, carried the measured language of official communications. But, the photograph itself carried something that no formal language can produce. It was released the following morning, the day after the banquet. By the time most of Britain had finished their first cup of tea, it had already traveled halfway around the world. What people saw when they looked at it was harder to articulate than the individual elements suggested. Two people. Expensive clothes, and historic jewels. Blossoming flowers, and all of that was there, and none of that was what stopped people mid-scroll and kept them there. What stopped people was the lean. The smile. The specific and unmistakable quality of two people who have been through something together and are still, on the other side of it, standing beside each other. Not performing proximity. Not demonstrating togetherness for the cameras. Just there, together, in the light of a March evening in Windsor, having done the work of the day and, now being, for one captured second, simply themselves. The photograph was compared almost immediately to a portrait that had been taken years before, the couple's first official portrait as the future king and queen, in which they had also stood in a similar position, similar posture, the same basic geometry of two people who are most comfortable in that particular configuration. That earlier portrait was suddenly being shared alongside the new one. People were placing them next to each other and looking at what the years between had done, or had not done, to the two people in both frames. What the comparison said was something that no press release and no official statement and no diplomatic ceremony could have said as simply or as directly. Pretty much, they were still them. After everything. Still leaning. Still smiling like that. The morning after the banquet, while the photograph was spreading across the internet with the quiet, exponential force of something that resonates without fully explaining why, the state visit was still unfinished. Its second day belonged largely to the president and the political machinery of the British government. President Tinubu traveled to Westminster Abbey to lay a wreath at the grave of the unknown warrior. He went to Downing Street for a bilateral meeting with Prime Minister Keir Starmer. First Lady Al-Yarimi Tinubu visited Lambeth Palace, where she attended a service of prayer and was invited to preach, a remarkable moment in its own right, a visiting head of state's wife standing in the chapel of the Archbishop of Canterbury and delivering a sermon. The day concluded with the presidential couple attending the Nigerian Modernism exhibition at Tate Modern, before a reception with members of the Nigerian diaspora in the United Kingdom. William and Catherine were less visibly present on the second day. Their work had been concentrated in the first, the greeting at the hotel, the ceremonial procession, the banquet, the portrait. In the rhythm of state visits, this isn't unusual. Different members of the royal family carry different parts of the program depending on their roles, their seniority, and the specific diplomatic weight of each scheduled event. But their absence from the cameras that Thursday made the photograph, already circulating at scale, feel somehow more concentrated, more final, as if the entire 2 days had been building to that single image and the image, now released, was all that remained to be said. The conversation it generated was wide and various and sometimes surprising. Fashion writers broke down the green gown with the precision of art historians analyzing a painting. They noted the high collar, the ruching, the sheer bishop sleeves, choices unusual for Catherine, who tends toward paler colors and simpler fabrics for formal occasions. They noted the way the deeper color allowed the decorations and regalia to stand apart from the fabric rather than compete with it. They noted the shoes, which had appeared before in an earlier portrait taken years ago, the first official portrait of William and Catherine as the future king and queen, a detail so specific that only people who track these things very closely would catch it, but which, once noticed, produced a small and genuine pleasure. The green gown had also been chosen for that earlier portrait. She had worn it again. For this portrait. Standing in the same position. The same man, and political and diplomatic commentators wrote about the visit in terms of trade figures and bilateral agreements and the significance of the first Nigerian state visit in nearly 4 decades. They pointed to the record levels of trade between the two countries, to the economic reforms underway in Nigeria under Tinubu's government, to the United Kingdom's interest in strengthening its partnerships across Africa in the post-Brexit scene. These were real and important things. The pomp and ceremony of a state visit exists partly to create the conditions in which serious conversations about serious subjects can take place, and those conversations had taken place during those 2 days in Windsor. The substance was there. The diplomatic outcomes were real. The geopolitics of the occasion weren't decoration. But, the photograph was also something that operated almost entirely outside the language of diplomacy and trade. People who shared it on social media weren't, for the most part, sharing it with captions about bilateral trade agreements. They were sharing it the way people share images that make them feel something without fully understanding what. The comments section of the Kensington Palace Instagram post accumulated responses in dozens of languages, from people in Nigeria and the United States and Pakistan and Brazil and countries that had no formal relationship with either the British royal family or the Nigerian state visit but that recognized something in the image that translated across every border. Part of what they were recognizing was Catherine herself, and the particular quality of her public presence in 2026 compared to what it had been in earlier years. She had been ill, and the world knew this because she had told the world herself, in a filmed address that had shaken people in ways they had not expected to be shaken. She had stepped for what it's worth, back from public duties during her treatment, returned gradually, navigated the territory of a very public health crisis with a privacy that had simultaneously frustrated and impressed the people who watched her. By the time the Nigerian state visit arrived, she had been back in full public life for a stretch long enough that her reappearance was no longer news. Which was itself a form of news, the fact that her presence in a photograph was simply her presence, not a recovery update, not evidence of something, just her, doing the work, leaning into the evening. People who TBH had watched her over the years noticed something in the portrait that was harder to name than a tiara or a gown. There was a quality of settledness to her. Not the polished, careful settledness of someone performing composure. The earlier Catherine, the one still learning how to be what she was being asked to be, had sometimes had that quality, the faint visible effort of presentation. What the photograph showed was a woman who had stopped working quite so hard at appearing a certain way, because she had become that way, or because she had let some earlier, more effortful version of it go and found what remained was more real and, in being more real, more compelling. Christiana Ebenezer saw this when she was behind the lens. She had not photographed William and Catherine before this evening. She came to them without the accumulated archive of a photographer who had spent years documenting the couple, without the context of comparison that everyone who had been watching them for years automatically brought. She saw them as they were that night, 2 people beside a flowering wall, dressed for a state dinner, at ease with each other in a way that her camera recognized before she fully processed it consciously. The image she made was the image she made because of what was in front of her, not because of anything she had imposed on it. This is the, to be fair, thing about portraits that work. They don't manufacture something that isn't there. They find what's there and hold it still long enough to be seen. The best portrait photographers understand that their job isn't to create the moment but to be present enough and skilled enough to catch it when it arrives. Christiana, at 26 pretty much years old, with a camera in St. George's Hall, Windsor actually, on a March evening in 2026, caught it. The image was released, which the image traveled. And then, because this is also how things work, the conversation around it began to fracture into smaller conversations that moved in different directions simultaneously. There were the people who focused on the fashion. The people who focused on the politics, the people who looked at the blossoms and wondered what kind of plant they were. The people who compared it to earlier portraits and found comfort or meaning in the continuity. The people in the Nigerian diaspora for whom the deliberate cultural acknowledgments of the visit, the designer, the green gown, the photographer meant something specific and personal, a recognition that their country and their heritage had been treated as something worth genuine consideration rather than convenient symbolism. And there were the people who just looked at the photograph and felt something they couldn't put into words and moved on with their day carrying that unnamed feeling with them. Beyond the photograph, sort of, and beyond the choreography of the 2 days that produced it, there was something else the Nigerian state visit represented that was easy to overlook in the immediate coverage: the question of continuity. The last such visit had been in 1989. The world that existed in 1989, the Cold War still standing, Nelson Mandela still imprisoned, the internet not yet available to ordinary people, the British royal family navigating an entirely different set of public pressures, was almost unrecognizable compared to the world of 2026. In those 37 years, the British monarchy had lost one of its most beloved members, had undergone upheavals that threatened its public standing, had watched its relationship with its own family fracture publicly in ways that produced global headlines. Nigeria had moved from military rule through multiple democratic transitions, had become the largest economy in Africa, had produced a diaspora spread across every continent whose cultural influence reached far beyond the numbers that any economic analysis could capture. That too well, countries with that much shared and complicated history could sit down at a table in Windsor, a table set with 3 days of preparation and lit with candles and laid with the best of British silver, and eat together and talk and be photographed together, and that the photograph would be taken by a woman born in Lagos who grew up in London and grew into someone whose eye was sharp enough to catch what was real in a room full of performance, was not a small thing. It was the kind of thing that looks like ceremony from the outside and is, from the inside, something harder to name. An attempt. A gesture towards something. The acknowledgement that history is long and the present moment is narrow and the future requires people to be willing to stand beside each other even when the weight of the past makes that standing complicated. To lean in, even slightly, toward the person beside them. To smile, not because the camera requires it, but because the evening has been long. The work has been done and there's, in that specific moment, something genuinely worth smiling about. The carriages had rolled. The anthems had played. The table had been set and the dinner had been eaten and the speeches had been made. The President of Nigeria had met the Prime Minister of Britain at Downing Street, and the First Lady had preached at Lambeth Palace, and the exhibition at the Tate Modern had been viewed, and the members of the Nigerian diaspora had gathered for their reception and had looked at the people who represented their home country's relationship with this other country and had felt whatever they felt about what they saw. And there was a photograph, taken by a young woman from Lagos by way of London, of two people standing beside flowering white blossoms in the light of a Windsor evening, in the clothes of their position and the posture of their life together, with nothing about them that needed to be explained or translated or performed. Just the lean. Just the smile. Just the image of two people, at the end of a long, layered and historically significant day, being exactly where they were supposed to be, and, by every available evidence, knowing it.